Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joanne Gabriel, and on behalf of Darien Library, I want to welcome you to our program, Planning the Perfect Vegetable Garden with experts Allison and Miranda Gould from Reading-based Homefront Farmers. I think it was Ben Franklin who was quoted as saying, "A failure to plan is a plan for failure." And this includes gardening as well. So while you can throw out seeds in May and hope for the best, a well-executed plan will bring you better results and more satisfaction with fewer disappointments. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenters this evening are seasoned experts in edible gardening for Homefront Farmers. Allison is a Stanford native and Yukon grad who has interned and worked on various ecological projects throughout Connecticut and has taught in various school gardens as well. Most recently, she led a successful career in nonprofit management. Miranda Gould has a decade of experience with growing edible gardens and has been with Homefront Farmers since its inception in 2012. She is a St. Olaf grad and has a certificate in permaculture from Cornell University's Co-op Extension at the Finger Lakes Permaculture Institute. Homefront Farmers specializes in the design, building, and maintenance of custom at-home vegetable gardens throughout Fairfield, Litchfield, and Westchester Counties. They are passionate about bringing all the benefits of edible gardening to the homeowner. And with that, please welcome Allison and Miranda.
Hi, hello everybody. I wish I could see all of your faces, but thank you for being here. I'm going to pull up my presentation and I'm just going to give you an overview of the session before we get into the meat of it. So in the first half of this session, we're going to go through all of the steps that we personally take at Homefront Farmers to plan our clients' gardens. And hopefully you can glean some tips and tricks and best practices from us. So the steps that we go through in planning our clients' gardens are assessing the garden, choosing what crops you're going to grow, mapping out your garden, ordering seeds, adding soil, composting, fertilizer, and of course, following through with your plan. In the second half of the presentation, of the session rather, you will have all the opportunity to ask all of your questions and have a spirited discussion. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. Miranda will be monitoring that while I'm presenting the slides. If you have a more general question, we'll ask that you hold that until the end so that we can address it in more detail. One more thing before I move on. This presentation has a lot of helpful resources linked throughout, and we will be emailing out a PDF so that you can click on all of that good stuff and bookmark it. All right, so getting into it, we're going to start with step one, assess your garden. So you're going to want to go out to your garden or the location where you think you want to have your garden and check it out. The most important thing is to figure out whether it's sunny or shady. You'll be able to tell that with your eyes, of course. It's also a good idea to figure out the cardinal direction. So take a compass or take your phone and you figure out which way is north. The best sun for your garden comes from the south. But of course, having a garden in full sun is best. Our gardens that are in the middle of like manicured lawns always do the best because they get sun all day long. If you have to plant your garden more near your house rather than in an open field, I know not everybody has that option. Like I said, the south facing side of your house is best because that's where the most light is going to come in. The sun is really important for crops like peppers and tomatoes and things like that need a lot of light. And then Next part of the assessment is your soil. So we do soil testing for all of our gardens in the fall. We use UMass's UMass Extension soil testing service. It's about $22 for a routine analysis and an additional $6 to assess percentage organic matter, which we do. You can see the picture on this slide is just a screenshot of the results of one of our soil tests. And, you know, don't worry if it doesn't make sense to you. There's a lot on there. All soil test results from UMass come with a very detailed page of recommendations and calculators, so you know what kind of materials to put down and how much to get your garden in tip-top shape. And when you're assessing the soil, it's important not just to pay attention to the nutrients, but just to like the quality and the texture of the soil. You're going to want to make sure that it's got a good drainage. And of course, that if you have raised beds, that there's enough soil in your raised beds. Step 2, choose your crops. This is the fun part that a lot of people like to do, especially this time of year when it's cold and rainy out. It's nice to cuddle up with your seed catalog and do some dreaming. Think about what you want, make a list, but make sure that you use what you learned in step 1 to inform what you can and can't grow. So for example, if you have a shady garden, you might not be able to plant so many, you know, peppers or watermelons or things that need a lot of sun. You got to work with what you got. Step 3, this is one of the big ones, is to map out your garden and count your plants so you know how much to purchase. We use a really awesome program called Grow Veg, which I have a screenshot here, but I'm gonna show you in a minute. It's very affordable. It's about $40 for the year, very accessible. A lot of people that I know in the gardening space use it. It's awesome. So before you go into Grow Veg, you have to measure your garden, or just, you know, if you have raised beds and you know the dimensions, that's great too. You got to get in Grow Veg and draw it out to scale accurately. That is really important for getting your plant spacing correct and counting your plants. Make sure that you rotate families from year to year. So if this isn't your first time gardening in your garden, knowing what you planted and where last year is really important. Rotating plant families can help reduce populations of pests and diseases. Also, don't forget about successions. So if you have a plant like squash, for example, that is not active for the whole entire growing season, you might be able to plant something before or after. Just make sure you keep that in mind and plan for that. All right, now I'm going to share my screen. Well, I'm sharing my screen with you now, but I'm going to X out of this window for a second and just show you the Grow Veg program in action. So this is just an example of a plan that I've been working on. This is the whole garden drawn out to scale. You know, if you zoom in, you can see we've got these cute little icons for each crop. We have a list of our plants here. So the nice thing about this program is that you can add your own preferred varieties and your own spacing, and you can basically customize everything, which is what we have done based on our experience and best practices. Another great feature is that, let's say this is last year's garden and you want to create a plan for next year's garden. You can create what they call a follow-on plan. So I'm here, I'm clicking the new button, new plan button, and it lets you create a follow-on plan, which copies over all of the garden beds, and it can even copy over your perennials or anything you want to copy over from the previous year. It does that for you automatically, which can be really helpful. A really important feature that will be helpful to you as a home gardener is the plant list. That's right here on this tab. So now this is a list of every plant that is on the garden plan. And in this column here, you have the count, and it tells you how many plants or how much space it's going to take up. So, and that will inform, when you're buying seeds or transplants, how many that you're going to buy. So that's really helpful. All right. Step 4, order your seeds. I've included a list here of companies that we order from. And like I said, this presentation will be available to you after the fact, and you'll be able to click on all these links and check out all the seed catalogs online. I would advise you, to order ASAP. As the spring approaches, they will start to sell out of popular things. Another important step is to determine what you're going to grow from seed versus transplant. We're not going to get into that right now. You could definitely figure that out with some research or chit-chatting with an expert. All right. Step 5 is to add soil, compost, and fertilizer. We actually do this step primarily in the fall so that any organic fertilizer or compost that we put down has time to, the microbes have time to work on it to be incorporated into the soil before the spring. But don't worry if you haven't done it yet. It's okay to do it in the spring too. The main things that you have to be aware of is number 1, if you notice that your raised beds, if you have raised beds and you notice that the soil level is looking low, you got to add some more in that. Use your dimensions to calculate how many cubic feet and purchase the soil and put it in there. So for us, best practice is that we add at least a 1/4 inch of compost to most of our gardens each year, depending on the level of organic matter. And that just keeps the soil nice and healthy, and it keeps, it keeps the microbiome alive and happy. Those good bacteria are really important to our garden. This is another thing that I would advise you to get out there and buy your stuff as soon as you can, because people are going to be really excited to garden. I'm guessing now after being locked in the house, people are going to be really excited to get out there and do it. So make sure you know what you need and you go and you get it from your local garden store. All right, step 6, we're at the end, is just to follow through with your plan. Make sure you have fun and enjoy the process. In my opinion, the nice thing about having a home garden is that you can treat it as a fun experiment, as opposed to with a client's garden. Of course, when I'm doing that, you don't want to make a mistake and you want it to be perfect. But if you're playing at your own house, you can do whatever you want. So if you make a mistake, you can treat it as a learning experience for next year. And that is a good segue into we just wanted to highlight the importance of record keeping. So like I said, if you make a mistake, if something you tried didn't work, make sure to jot it down. Or if it did work, make sure to jot it down. All this information is really important to future planning. Some examples of things that you should mark down are just any last minute changes to your plan, just so you have an accurate record to work from in following years. You want to pay attention to when things bloomed or fruited or when things were harvested, just to inform any succession planting that you might want to do. Photos are always helpful, and make sure to note the date. It's just another great way to keep track of what's going on and when. Any pests and diseases you notice, might be good to jot it down so you can problem solve and how to get rid of them and manage them. And there's so many more benefits of keeping a good record. Great. So now we are going to move on to the Q&A portion of our session. If you have a question, I see the chat box is blown up. That's great. Yeah, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we will do our best to answer it.
I'm just going to start out by kind of going over some of these questions that were asked already. Soil assessment, what do you learn? How do you respond? So their recommendations underneath the soil test portion, which you saw, they will include a recommendation of, a certain number of pounds of sulfur or sulfate of potash or, bone meal or whatever it is that you need. They will recommend underneath that. And then you can just figure out the square footage of your garden that you need to make that amendment and do a little bit of basic math to figure out the exact amount. They will say, like 5 pounds per 100 square feet or something like that. You're going to learn also about garden pH and the percentage of organic matter with the soil test. So the ideal percentage of organic matter is between 6 and 9%. If you have over that, if you have above 9% organic matter, that may mean that you do not need to add any compost at all, because compost will add organic matter. So that's just a heads up that you don't need to add compost and soil amendments every year. You can just follow the soil test if all other signs are go. We really like to test the soil in late summer so that we can get the results back. Usually it takes about 6 weeks. You have to take the sample, dry it, mail it in to the lab, and then the lab processes it, so probably at least 4 weeks from when it reaches the lab to give them to process it. And they'll email it back to you. So, we like to take the sample in late summer and then be able to do the soil amendments in the fall. And the reason we like to get them done in the fall is because in the spring, we're very busy and we're eager to plant, and we don't want anyone to be behind. We want to be able to plant as soon as the ground thaws. It also takes a little bit of time for some of the nutrients to percolate down into the soil. So when you apply them in the fall, it gives a little bit more time and a boost for, as Allison said, the microorganisms to start breaking down those nutrients and for them to actually get into the root zones. So, and take effect. So that is that. And then one of the other questions is compost all the same? What do you recommend? There are a million different composts out there. I'd say overall, you really want to just make sure that it's well broken down. You don't want to be using mulch as compost because if your compost is not fully broken down, it's chunky organic matter that's actually going to rob nitrogen from your plants, which you do not want. So, some of the bagged brands, organic brands that we've used and would recommend in the future is Coast of Maine and Vermont compost, not limited to, but those are some good ones. No Miracle-Gro. All right. How many trees do you need on your property for the maple syrup program? That is a great question. So it's not just about the number of trees, it's also about their size. If you have one really large maple tree, we can actually put multiple taps in it. So, I'd say the best course of action is just to get in touch with us and we can do a site visit and let you know, what you have there. what are our thoughts on square foot gardening? So just a caveat that I have never done square foot gardening, so I don't know a ton about it. I think it's mostly just a method to be able to grow a lot of things in a small space. There's nothing wrong with it other than, some things take up more than a square foot. So I'd say in general, you don't need to do square foot gardening. I think it's a little hyped up. You can definitely just, look at your spacings on the back of a seed packet. And the amazing thing about Grow Veg, that it's such a great planner, and they actually have a square foot gardening mode in Grow Veg. I've never used it, but they do have that if you like to do square foot gardening. But all of the spacings are built in Grow Veg, so you don't have to worry about being way off. For container gardeners, what bag soil should be bought? That's a great question. So I will actually recommend Gilberti's in Westport. They sell garden soil. So most garden soil is a mix of topsoil and compost, usually 60% topsoil and 40% compost. And I believe you can buy that at Gilberti's. They have like organic compost mixed in. As far as bag stuff goes, I think both Vermont and Coast of Maine also have raised bed soil, but you want to make sure that you're buying garden soil and not potting soil or compost. You don't want to plant things in a straight compost. Okay. Where do you recommend you get your soil? So yeah, you can get soil at Gilberti's in Easton, or sorry, their wholesales in Easton, their retail stores in Westport. You can also use many different landscaping companies can get topsoil for you. And topsoil is not really ever going to be organic because it's topsoil, but you can get organic compost to go in it. Can you use other maple trees for the sugar mapling program? I believe the answer is yes, and we can help you identify which other maples you might be able to use. Yes. How do you deter deer and other hungry animals? Okay, great question. So the first thing I would say is you need a fence. The kind of fence kind of depends on what animals you have around. So we build our gardens with 5-foot fences for deer and other animals. Deer have poor depth perception, so they're not going to jump into a raised bed garden because it looks kind of rocky and like they don't want to get caught in there and break their foot, not be able to get out, or some kind of thing like that. So they don't really jump in there. If you have a big wide open garden that does not have raised beds and is just in ground, I would recommend an 8-foot fence for deer. You also want to make sure that you're digging down a little bit so that you're keeping out woodchucks, which are the worst. If you have really bad like mouse and vole problems, you can dig down hardware cloth, which is actually 1/2 inch, to keep them from coming in. Some people will fully enclose gardens with hardware cloth. That's basically the only way to keep out chipmunks and squirrels, like without any shadow of a doubt. But they're not always an issue. So, and it can be a very expensive endeavor to completely enclose a garden with hardware cloth. We generally don't do it by default. Let's see. Oh, and birds, sometimes birds can be an issue, or crows actually. You can use bird netting for those kinds of things. What can be grown with a minimum of sun? Yes. Okay. So the two vegetables in particular that do fairly well with less sun is lettuce and beans. Not peas, beans, like green beans, bush beans, pole beans, and lettuces, not kale, spinach, Swiss chard, but just straight up lettuce. Those things can do the best with the least amount of sun. They still need some sun. So even lettuce and beans have their limit of how much sun they need. But you could get away with a half day. Like if you have a tall line of trees on the east side, so you're only getting half a day's worth of sun in your garden, you can get away with that. But I would probably not recommend doing a ton of like bell peppers or beefsteak tomatoes that are going to take forever to ripen for you. Things are kind of on a continuum. You can do other leafy vegetables and some root vegetables with, a little bit of shade. And even cherry tomatoes, like if you're going to do tomatoes in any kind of shade, you really want to go for the smaller varieties because they'll produce more for you. But peppers, melons, those kinds of things, they need full sun all day, and if you don't give them that, they will let you know by not producing. Okay. Do you recommend using mulch? Yes. So I would say it depends. Pros of mulch are that it really encourages biological activity, and of course it can help prevent weeds from coming up. But if you already have an area that is very, very weedy, it can be really difficult to control it with just mulch. So what I would recommend is either put a tarp over it or some kind of thick weed block in the summer months for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And that's a process you can use called solarization, where you basically just bake it. So, like the perfect instance to use this is if you have some pathways with gravel down and you have weeds growing up through the pathways, you can use the tarp method to like really get some crazy weeds out of there. You can also use a tool called a hula hoe or a wire weeder. This is the most helpful when you have just a bare soil with no mulch, and then you get a blanket of weeds that are like 2 inches tall. That's the perfect time on a sunny day when, the top layer can dry out a bit. That's the perfect time to use a hula hoe or a wire weeder. And it's basically just scraping the top surface of the soil up a little bit, so you're getting rid of the weeds, both the germinating seeds and the shorter weeds that are growing there. I would recommend, if you have like a really weedy soil, to use a hula hoe weekly until like the end of June, and then put mulch down once you have the weeds under control. And the hula hoes come in different diameters, so you can work around smaller plantings like lettuces and things like that. But you have to make sure that you're not cutting them all down when you do it. But for mulch, I would say I like to mulch things that are going to be in the ground the entire season. So nowhere, like I wouldn't do it in a spot where you're going to do successions. Like lettuce, if you're going to keep planting lettuce in the same spot, 5 times over the course of the season, it's kind of a silly place to do mulch. If you want to do it under tomatoes or zinnias or things like that, it's really great because it can prevent backsplash when you have a really heavy rain. Your plants will stay cleaner, and it helps prevent diseases, soil-borne diseases, from coming up. Okay, starting with beds better than without using beds. So raised beds have a lot of benefits. They increase your drainage because you can put really nice, fertile, rich well draining loose soil in there. Depending on, where you build your garden, if you're building it on the bottom of a hill, water may collect there. So the raised beds can help kind of boost everything up to prevent the plants from being waterlogged. The second really big thing is that it just is way easier to garden when you can delineate the pathways from the beds. I'm sure if anyone has an in-ground garden where their pathways are sod, or there's not really a barrier between the bed and the pathway, and you get lots of weeds growing there, it's just a hassle. And especially if like the sod's just going to keep encroaching on the beds and things like that. So it's much neater and less labor intensive to have a delineation between your pathways and have your pathways well maintained with weed block and gravel or something like that. Mulch for pathways is okay, but it does break down and eventually becomes compost that weeds can grow in. So I don't generally recommend it. I think gravel's much better. Okay. Is gardening, let's see, we did that one. Can you plant flowers in the vegetable garden? Absolutely, yes. The only thing I would watch out for is shading, because a lot of flowers, including some of the really popular ones like zinnias, sunflowers, dahlias, they're pretty tall, and we don't want to shade anything else in the veggie garden out. So, you want to put the tallest plants on the north side of your garden. Plan that so that your garden kind of forms like a cup to catch all of the sun from the south, east, west. So yeah, keep those tall flowers on the north side. But in general, we highly encourage our clients to have flowers in the garden, especially flowers from the aster family and other families that attract beneficial insects. So it helps keep the bad bugs in check by getting, parasitic wasps and other things to balance out your ecosystem. So zinnias are great for that. Sunflowers, yarrow, flowering herbs are awesome. There's a huge long list that you can put in there. Oh, and just a little bit on lavender. I like to talk about lavender because everyone loves it so much, and I love it too. It is not easy to grow. It requires really good drainage. If you have a stone wall somewhere and a raised bed along a stone wall, that's the perfect place to plant your lavender. But it does not like to have wet leaves. It's meant to be in the Mediterranean where it's drier than it is here, so it can be a little susceptible to mildew and things like that. Munstead is the hardiest variety for wintering over. Usually in a good year, we'll get about 60% of the Munstead plants wintering over, but you never really know what you're going to get. Down in Darien, you're more on the water, so you don't get quite the temperature swings, so you might have a little more success. But lavender also attracts a lot of cabbage looper moths, which are not the greatest thing for your kale and Brussels sprouts and everything. So altogether, like if you're looking for a flower to go in your garden that's going to attract beneficials, lavender is not my favorite as much as the other ones, even though it smells delicious. Okay. Can you talk a little about warm weather vegetables versus cold weather and when you should plant each type? Yes. Okay, so cold weather crops, generally our season starts in early April, and we plant all of our cool weather crops the first, second, and third week of April, depending on what the weather is like. So that's going to include any kind of brassica, which is kale, broccoli, cabbage, collards, arugula, radishes, turnips, that kind of thing. And chennapods, which are beets, Swiss chard, and spinach. You'll also plant things like onions, are pretty, cool weather friendly and like to go in early. And some berries like strawberries. Warm weather stuff, you really want to be conservative and wait for the weather to warm. It's a very classic mistake to put things out too early and it's just too cold, and plants can get really stunted and not grow the best if you jump the gun. So, we generally plant the 3rd week of May, most of our cool warm weather crops. But for things like peppers and sweet potatoes that really need it warm, we might wait even as late as the 1st week of June if the weather is just not warm enough. So obviously you need to wait after the first frost. Generally that date is mid-May, but we like to err on the cautious side. And you'd be amazed at how fast your plants will grow when you plant them out when it's actually warm. Instead of sitting there in the cold rain for a week. Would lavender benefit from being surrounded by gravel even if the rest of the bed is mulched? Yeah, I mean, so it likes heat and stones give off heat. You just, it would need to be on the surface. You wouldn't want to put gravel in the root zone. So. Can you explain cover crops and what they do to the soil, and when should you plant them, and what is a cover crop? Okay, so I'm just gonna briefly glaze over this one. There are many different cover crops and they're all gonna have different answers as to when you plant them and how you use them. And I would say before you put a cover crop down, you're gonna wanna do your research on when it needs to be planted. We don't really use any cover crops in our gardens at this time because we're really trying to get 3-season harvests for our clients and ourselves. And we're working in small gardens, and every cover crop that I'm aware of, that I know of, you would need to, it's only going to grow when there's not snow and the ground's frozen. So it still does occupy and take up time in the garden. So if you just have a small garden and you're looking to get the most out of it, a cover crop is probably more appropriate for on like a farming level, or if you have a larger garden that you're okay with part of it just not doing much for a little while. And then a lot of them, you need to make sure that you turn them in at the right time before they seed out, because it can actually become like almost like a weed issue, even though it's not a weed. But you just need to know exactly how to take care of it. So it is really great. Cover crops can fix nitrogen and really promote a lot of biology. So if you do have the space and the time to utilize them, they can be amazing. Yeah. Okay. I have a really hard time growing spinach. It always bolts. How early should the seeds go into the ground? I love this one. Okay, so spinach is a cool weather crop. It will only grow well in the spring and the fall, bar none. Do not try growing spinach in the summer. It will not happen. So it's nothing to do with you. It's just how that plant is. So you can plant spinach 2 times a year, basically. You can plant it in April. I would recommend early April, but you can keep going until late April, possibly the 1st week of May. And then you're going to get your harvest in late May to mid-June, depending on the weather. And then it's going to flower and you're going to pull it out. Then you can plant something else like summer squash or bush beans or whatever else that you want your succession to be for the summer, something that likes the hot weather. Then you can plant it again for fall. You can plant it in September. If you're going to plant it from seed, I would plant it more along the lines of late August. We grow seedlings in our greenhouse, and we generally put them out the first or second week of September. And those you can get a harvest out of in the fall, and then you can leave them in the ground to winter over into the next spring. And then you get an extra early harvest of spinach the year after, and it's the most amazing thing in the world. So spinach is a great one. It's not you, it's just the plant. But it is a heavy feeder, so you want to make sure that when you transplant it, you fertilize it. If it's not looking like it's doing so hot, if the leaves are a little yellow, try giving it a little bit of plant food, and it should deliver for you. Okay. For cold and warm weather planting, confirming you are referring to seeds or plants. We use both depending on the crop. Some things like to be seeded in the greenhouse first and then go out, and other things like to be direct seeded. I'm referring to the timing that you plant things outside, regardless of whether that's from seed or transplant. So for example, tomatoes and peppers, we would start in our greenhouse in February. Obviously, we're not planting them outside in February. And then we would grow them up big and strong and put them out in mid to late May. Whereas, arugula, we grow from seed, we direct seed that into the soil, and you can start direct seeding arugula generally in early April. Okay. Would tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce benefit from landscape fabric with drip lines, or does that make it too hot? Okay, so I think you're asking about using landscape fabric as weed block. Yeah, I wouldn't. Landscape fabric would make it pretty warm under there. If you're going to use, if you want to use like a fabricated mulch over your plants, you probably want to purchase something that's actually meant for that. I believe on Johnny's you can purchase all sorts of mulch paper, and they have different colors that won't burn the plants. But regular mulch works great too. And lots of times the mulch papers will break down after a year, and then they look kind of gross in the garden, to be honest. So I think mulch is probably the better item to go with. All right. Sometimes I don't get around to cleaning up my veggie garden in the fall. Is that a bad thing? So yeah, I totally feel you on this one. It could be hard to get to it, but it really is preferable to clean up your garden in the fall. You really want to get like all those little tiny cherry tomatoes that have fallen down onto the ground. You want to make sure that you get all of the plant material up out of the soil. And this is to prevent wintering over of diseases in the soil from year to year. So, when you pull out your plants, make sure you get that root ball out, make sure you're cleaning up all the little dropped fruits and, digging up all the potatoes and all the carrots and all that, because they can really be like the perfect source for many pests and diseases to winter over. And then you're not behind when you get to the following spring. But I know it's not perfect. But if you don't get to it in the fall, then you want to make sure to do that same thing in the spring as soon as the ground thaws. I've heard the best way to water vegetables is drip irrigation. Do you agree? And if you don't have drip irrigation, when is the best time to water your veggie garden? So yeah, drip irrigation is the best. You're trying to keep the soil moist, but you want to prevent the leaves from getting wet because it just percolates all sorts of nice fungal and disease issues, especially for tomatoes and cucumbers, melons, that kind of thing. So drip irrigation is always the best. Also, you know, most of us like going on vacation at some point in the summer. So if you want to go away for longer than like a day or two, you're going to need watering. And, you know, if you don't have a neighbor nearby to do it for you, drip irrigation is really convenient to have. If you're going to hand water, that's fine. I would say make sure that you do it either early in the morning or yeah, early in the morning for hand watering is really the best so that the plants have a chance to dry off later in the day before it gets dark. You don't want wet plants hanging out in the dark overnight because that's when you can spread a lot of disease. And just again, making sure to try to water just the soil and not the plant leaves. It is February 3rd. What can we be doing now? Feel like I am way behind. You can be planning and you can be buying seeds. That's what you can be doing. And you're not way behind, so don't worry. Why do my zucchini plant leaves turn white in late summer and how do you manage them? Do you need to remove the leaves? They're still producing zucchini. That is an interesting one that I think you mean powdery mildew. I was envisioning some other kind of thing turning white, but I think this person is talking about powdery mildew. It is a powdery white mildew that affects zucchini leaves. There are 2 organic sprays that you can use in rotation to help prevent that. It's never gonna totally prevent it and it's never gonna make it totally go away. The better one, one of the brand names is Green Cure, but it's basically sodium bicarbonate, like baking soda. So it turns the pH of the leaf more alkaline and you can literally see the mildew just like being erased off of the leaf. The trick with a lot of sprays is that you want to try and get it underneath the leaves, not just on the top of the leaf, to actually be effective. So yeah, I would recommend that. And yeah, for the worst leaves, like you can just prune them off toward the base of the plant and you know, it'll keep growing. The growth point will probably be the least affected and have like nice healthy green leaves. So it's kind of just weekly pruning is needed for all things, including zucchini. Can you talk about growing herbs and some of your favorites in the garden? Oh, sure. I mean, all of the herbs are great. Most herbs are very easy to grow. So I'd say like if you're a beginner vegetable gardener and you haven't done much, like just throw in all the herbs because none of them are super hard. One thing I will say is that basil is prone to a disease called basil downy mildew. So you should look for varieties that are resistant to basil downy mildew because it can like literally destroy your stand of basil in a week and it's really gross. We are using a variety called Devotion this year that's supposed to be, you know, the best for controlling that. It's still a sweet basil variety, but it's more resistant to that mildew. But otherwise, most herbs are very easy to grow and you can have fun. I would say like lemongrass is really fun. Stevia is like a total conversation starter. And sage is lovely. Yeah, I mean, it's whatever you like eating, I guess. Pesto making. I want to grow potatoes. Can I use old potatoes that start growing in my pantry? Awesome question. I highly recommend not to. That is because you want to buy certified organic seed potatoes because these are tested for diseases to make sure that you're not going to be propagating diseases inadvertently. And so the seed potatoes are tested in ways that like potatoes for eating are not. Also, if you get grocery store potatoes, sometimes they have sprout inhibitors on them. So, that's not great. And remember that when we're talking about diseases, most of the time diseases affect things within the same plant family. So a disease that affects potatoes are probably also going to affect your tomatoes and your peppers and your eggplant. So I would play it safe and buy some seed potatoes. Is there such thing as perennial vegetable? I've heard that there are some out there. Yes, there are. So asparagus is a perennial vegetable. Rhubarb is a perennial. Obviously, we all know of berries, brambleberries, strawberries. There are some other weird, funky ones, but I think those are kind of the most popular. Asparagus is great to grow. It takes about 3 years in order for it to get established. So if you have a really small garden, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you have a bit of space, it can be really great. And those plants can live for like 20 years if they're healthy. Favorite non-beefsteak tomato varieties? Yay. Golden Rave is my all-time favorite. You can buy it at Johnny's. It's kind of the shape of like a lemon, between the shape of a lemon and an egg, and it's yellow. Super productive, great for everything. Sun Gold is, hands down our favorite cherry tomato. It's an orange cherry tomato, sweet as candy. Yeah, those are the ones that kind of jump out. What's your favorite, Allison?
I was gonna say Sun Gold. They are like so tender and sweet. It really is. It really is like eating candy. I like some of the paste tomatoes too. I like to make sauce. So I like our speckled romans. It's like one of those oblong tomatoes. For those of you who don't know, they're very beautiful.
Aroma tomato with golden stripes. So
yes.
As far as my favorite beefsteak, I will say I am a sucker for striped Germans. They're a huge yellow beefsteak tomato with a pink burst of color in the bottom of it. That flavor, it's huge and the flavor is awesome. Very fruity, kind of similar to Sun Gold. I don't have the budget for a fence. Can you suggest how to grow vegetables without one? I do not recommend it at all. I would say go with your woody herbs. So here are the things that you can grow that are edible without a fence. Woody herbs, so rosemary, thyme, oregano, those kinds of things. Anything in the onion family, garlic, onions, scallions. Although I have seen deer eat at like really small seedlings. Cilantro, dill, fennel. That's basically it. You might be able to get away with tomatoes if you protect them while they're young and you trellis them up really tall. But even if you just make a makeshift fence with, those like green metal bars from Home Depot, like get yourself a fence. Because it's not a matter of if they will come, it's a matter of when. My beets don't produce beets, if you know what I mean. What am I doing wrong? Love it. Beets are heavy producers, so I'd recommend a couple things. Grow them from transplants. Transplant them very carefully so you don't mess the roots up a lot. You want to be gentle with them. Fertilize them well every like 3 weeks. They're heavy feeders. And you also need to thin them very, very widely. So I would recommend one plant every 4 to 6 inches for you to get nice big beets. And they take at least half a season. So that's that. What's your favorite carrot in seed form? So we only ever grow carrots from seed. They will all be from seed. Most Nance varieties are great. Nelson, Napoli, Yaya, they're all, the orange ones are the sweetest. Nance in particular. Nantes is Nance is just like a category of carrot. And then there are varieties within that. All right, we have 4 minutes. What vegetables can grow nicely in a container and look nice? Yeah, I would say most kale and Swiss chard, especially kale that is like purple or has different colors in it, can be really, really beautiful. One of my favorites is rainbow lacinato. Red Russian is also really pretty. Just the colors of Swiss chard can be really nice in a container. And both of those things just are like the gift that keeps on giving. They just keep producing throughout the season, so you don't have to change them out with anything else. You know, herbs can be really nice in container. Peppers grow really well in containers too. So especially like, you wouldn't want to do bell peppers just because if you're doing containers, you're probably not doing a lot of them. You have limited space. So I would keep it with small fruited peppers, especially like hot peppers and shishitos, where you only need like 3 plants to have a good amount. And they look nice too. Can you suggest an organic fertilizer to use? Yeah, so at transplanting, we like to use a water soluble fertilizer like a fish emulsion. I think King Neptune is one brand, but yeah, an organic fish emulsion is nice for transplanting. And then also a granular fertilizer, we use something called 724, but you can get like Espoma. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is one brand that I've seen around. And you can put that down as needed.
Thank you so much for coming and giving us all your tips. And thank you everyone for attending tonight's programming event. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.